Zoe Carter, a hard-working waitress at a small cafe, had never imagined that an ordinary shift could turn her world upside down. She moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays and refilling coffee cups, her mind preoccupied with the usual concerns of making ends meet. But as she cleared one of the tables, her eyes inadvertently landed on a wallet left open by a wealthy customer, a sharply dressed, powerful-looking white man. At first, she barely paid attention, assuming it was just another businessman stopping by for coffee. But then, something caught her eye, a photograph tucked inside the wallet. Her hands froze mid-motion, her breath hitching in her throat. The woman in the picture looked strikingly familiar. No, it wasn't just a resemblance, Zoe was certain. It was her mother. A cold shiver ran down her spine as a storm of emotions swirled inside her, confusion, shock, and an eerie sense of unease. Why did this man have a picture of her mother? What connection could he possibly have to her family? Zoe's pulse quickened as her mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was he someone from her mother's past? A long-lost relative? Or worse, was there a secret her mother had never told her? She forced herself to remain calm, but her fingers trembled as she pretended to wipe the table, stealing another glance at the man. He seemed completely unaware of her turmoil, casually sipping his coffee, scrolling through his phone as if nothing were amiss. Zoe knew she couldn't just ignore this. She needed answers. And she was determined to find out who this man was, and what he had to do with her mother. Zoe's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. Her breath came in shallow, uneasy waves as she struggled to maintain her composure. The cafe bustled around her, customers chatting, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of background music, but all of it faded into a dull blur. Her entire focus was on the man sitting at the corner table, the man who unknowingly held a piece of her past in his hands. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. If she reacted too strongly, she might scare him off or, worse, reveal too much of what she was thinking. No, she had to be smart. Careful. She forced her trembling hands to still and took a slow breath before stepping forward. Her footsteps felt heavy as she approached his table, each step carrying the weight of her uncertainty and growing fear. "Excuse me, sir," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could, though there was an undeniable edge of tension beneath it. "Would you like a refill on your coffee?" The man barely looked up from his phone at first. When he finally did, his sharp blue eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she felt as though he could see straight through her. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with a calm but distant expression, the kind of man who had learned to keep his emotions locked away. His face was unreadable, but Zoe wasn't fooled, there was something behind those eyes. Something hidden. "Sure," he replied in a casual tone, sliding his cup toward her. As she reached for it, her gaze flickered to the open wallet on the table. The photograph inside remained in plain view, a woman's face staring back at her, hauntingly familiar. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to snatch it up, to demand answers, to force this man to tell her everything he knew. But she couldn't afford to be reckless. She had to keep her emotions in check. Instead, she forced a polite smile, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "That's a nice picture," she said, keeping her voice light despite the racing thoughts in her mind. "She looks familiar. Is she someone close to you?" For the briefest moment, she saw something flicker in the man's expression, hesitation, maybe even pain. His eyes dropped to the wallet as if he had only just realized the photograph was exposed. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the wallet and tucked it away into his jacket pocket. "She was," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. Zoe's stomach twisted. "Was," the word echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. It was such a simple word, yet it carried so much weight. Past tense. Did that mean she was gone? What did this man know? Her pulse quickened, and for the first time, real fear settled deep in her chest. This was no coincidence. This man knew something about her mother. Something important. And no matter what it took, Zoe was going to find out the truth. Zoe's hands trembled ever so slightly as she poured the steaming coffee into the cup, the dark liquid swirling in a mesmerizing spiral before settling. She clenched her jaw, willing herself to remain steady, but the weight of uncertainty pressed against her chest. Who was this man sitting across from her? How did he know her mother? And why did he seem so hesitant, as if he were debating whether to reveal a long-buried secret? She took a slow, deep breath and carefully placed the cup in front of him, her fingers brushing against the smooth ceramic for a second longer than necessary. "Here you go," she said, her voice calm, though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She wanted answers, but she knew she couldn't push too hard, not yet. The man nodded, wrapping his large, weathered hands around the cup as though drawing warmth from it. He sat there, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the dark surface of the coffee as if searching for something, perhaps memories he had long tried to forget. Zoe studied him closely, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened slightly against the porcelain. Then, finally, he spoke, softly, almost hesitantly. "You remind me of someone." Zoe's breath caught. She had expected vague answers, maybe even denial, but this was something. A thread she could pull on. She steadied herself, trying not to let her excitement show. "Oh," she asked, tilting her head slightly, feigning curiosity. "Who?" The man exhaled, a quiet sigh barely audible above the hum of the cafe. He didn't meet her eyes right away. Instead, he stared down at the cup, his grip tightening as if grounding himself. "Someone from a long time ago," he murmured, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver down Zoe's spine. She felt her pulse quicken. Her instincts screamed that he was talking about her mother, but she knew better than to ask outright. Instead, she softened her voice. "She must have been important to you." A flicker of something, pain, maybe regret, flashed across his face before he masked it with a neutral expression. "She was," he admitted, his voice distant, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. He lifted the cup and took a slow sip, the movement deliberate, as though stalling for time. Zoe hesitated. She had to tread carefully, but she couldn't let the opportunity slip away. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. "I couldn't help but notice the picture in your wallet." She watched him closely, searching for any reaction. "She looks familiar to me too." For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, surprise? Recognition? But just as quickly, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, and he lowered the cup, setting it down with a quiet but decisive clink against the table. "You must be mistaken," he said, his tone suddenly guarded. His hand moved swiftly, slipping the wallet deeper into his jacket, as though shielding it from view. The shift was subtle, but Zoe didn't miss it. He was hiding something. Her stomach twisted, a mix of frustration and determination building inside her. He knew something important. And now, more than ever, she needed to find out what it was. Zoe's hands were trembling as they rested on the edge of the table, the coolness of the metal seeping into her skin, grounding her just a little. Her gaze never left the man in front of her, studying every nuance of his expression, looking for any sign that he might finally tell her the truth. His face remained mostly unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a shift in his posture that told Zoe more than words ever could. This wasn't just any man. He had something to do with her mother. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The silence between them stretched on like an eternity, thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest. Zoe could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what she was asking. But she couldn't back down now. She needed to know, and the answers were right there, just beneath the surface, waiting for her to dig them out. She leaned forward slightly, her breath shallow as she locked eyes with him. Her voice, though quiet, was steady, laced with determination. "I'm not mistaken," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the silence like a knife. "That photograph wasn't just a coincidence. It was my mother, and you." She paused, her words hanging in the air. "You knew her, didn't you?" His eyes darkened, a flicker of something unreadable flashing across his face. For a long moment, he didn't respond, just stared at her as if he were debating whether to open a door he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Zoe could see the internal battle playing out behind his eyes, the way his jaw tightened and his hands subtly clenched around his cup. It was as though he was struggling to keep his emotions locked away, but the cracks were starting to show. Zoe's heart beat faster. She wasn't going to let him shut down. Not this time. She leaned in even closer, her voice quiet but firm. "You're not going to hide anymore. I know it wasn't just a casual connection. You knew my mother. You know who I am, don't you?" Her words were filled with a raw desperation, the kind that only comes when you've spent a lifetime searching for answers, only to find that the person who holds the key is standing right in front of you, refusing to speak. For a long time, he remained silent, as though he were trying to process her words, to find the right way to respond. His fingers tapped against the side of the cup, the only movement in the stillness. Zoe watched him, her stomach tightening, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "You don't understand," he said, the words carrying a weight of regret. "Some things are better left buried. Some questions shouldn't be asked." Zoe's heart dropped. She had heard those words before, spoken by people who wanted to sweep the truth under the rug, who thought silence could make the past disappear. But Zoe knew better. The past never stayed buried, not for long. It had a way of resurfacing, clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. And she wasn't going to let it stay buried any longer. "Not to me," she shot back, her voice sharp now, no longer holding back the anger that had been simmering just below the surface. "You don't get to make that choice for me. I've spent my entire life not knowing, and I'm not going to walk away from this. Not now." His eyes flickered with something, maybe guilt, maybe the weight of years spent hiding the truth, but he didn't back down. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like he was resigning himself to something he couldn't control anymore. "Do you really want to hear this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were asking himself as much as her. "Because once you know, there's no going back. You can't unhear it. And the truth? It won't be what you expect." Zoe's heart hammered in her chest, the intensity of the moment almost too much to bear. But she held his gaze, refusing to look away. She nodded, a small but firm movement. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything she had been through. "I need to know." For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Zoe thought for a second that maybe he would leave it there, that he wouldn't answer her after all. But then, slowly, he sat back in his chair, his shoulders slumping as though the burden of the secret had been weighing on him for far too long. He reached into his suit jacket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet, and before Zoe could even react, he placed the photograph, the one of her mother, on the table between them. Zoe's breath hitched, her eyes locked on the photo. It was the same one her mother had kept in the small box under her bed, the one Zoe had memorized as a child. "You knew her," Zoe whispered, her voice trembling now. The man met her gaze, his face unreadable, but his eyes were full of something raw, something painful. "I didn't just know her," he said, his voice hoarse. "I loved her." Zoe froze. Her mind went blank for a moment as the weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. "You, what?" she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. "You loved her?" He nodded, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I loved her. But I walked away. I thought I could come back for her when I had everything figured out, when I had the money, the future. But by the time I was ready, she was gone." Zoe's chest tightened. The anger, the frustration, the years of confusion all came rushing to the surface in an overwhelming wave. "You left her for money?" she asked, her voice sharp and filled with disbelief. "You left her to struggle while you built your empire? You think that's love?" The man's gaze darkened, and he looked away for a moment, as though trying to shield himself from her words. "It wasn't like that," he murmured. "I thought I could come back for her later. But by the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. She was gone." Zoe's hands curled into fists, the pain in her chest almost unbearable. Her mother had given everything for Zoe. She had sacrificed everything for her child, and this man, this billionaire, had walked away, leaving her to carry the burden alone. But despite the anger, despite the betrayal, Zoe couldn't ignore the sadness that filled his voice. There was regret there, deep regret, a regret that Zoe knew all too well. She had lived with it her whole life, trying to piece together the fragments of a story her mother never told. "She never told me about you," Zoe said softly, her voice breaking. "Not once." The man's eyes darkened with pain. "She didn't want you to know. She didn't want you to carry the weight of my mistakes." Zoe shook her head slowly, the tears threatening to spill over. "She protected me from you," she whispered, the words hanging heavily in the air between them. For a moment, the man didn't speak. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years of regret. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe she was right," he said quietly. "Maybe I didn't deserve to be in your life." Zoe felt a pang of something, sympathy, perhaps, or maybe just the heavy burden of knowing how much both of them had lost. But she wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. "I don't know what to do with this," Zoe said quietly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "But I can't pretend it doesn't matter." Neither of them spoke for a long time, the silence between them thick and heavy with all that had been said, and all that had been left unsaid. Zoe stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for the pendant around her neck, the one her mother had left behind. She placed it on the desk between them, her fingers brushing the cool metal as she said softly, "I'm not ready to forgive you." "Not yet." Richard Lawson didn't respond. He simply nodded, his face a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. Zoe turned to walk away, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had made a choice. She wasn't closing the door entirely. Not yet. But she wasn't walking away without giving herself the chance to heal. To understand. And as she left the office, the weight of her decision pressing down on her, she knew one thing for certain: the past couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, the future could be rewritten. Together. Zoe stood in the doorway, the weight of the room pressing down on her. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one competing for her attention. The truth had just been laid bare, and it felt like a heavy storm had broken over her. Her heart was a tangled mess of confusion, pain, and disbelief. For so long, there had been whispers of something missing, a part of her life that felt out of place, but now, the revelation had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. She had always suspected there was more to her story, but she never imagined this. As the man's words echoed in her mind, she couldn't escape the intense wave of emotions flooding her. The photograph, the confession, the history that now lay in front of her, nothing felt real. It was as though the floor beneath her had disappeared, leaving her suspended in midair, trying to grasp at something solid, but finding only emptiness. Her mother's face, the woman who had been her world, was no longer just a memory. Zoe could feel her mother's presence, the love, the comfort, the safety she had provided, but now she was beginning to see the cracks in that perfect image. She had kept secrets, and now those secrets were laid before her, too raw to ignore. Zoe turned her gaze to Richard Lawson, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his quiet, sorrowful figure. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked at her, as though he couldn't bear to face the consequence of his actions. He was a stranger in many ways, yet he was so deeply entwined in the very core of the puzzle that was her life. His expression was full of regret, of guilt, but for Zoe, it wasn't enough. The apology in his eyes did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. It couldn't undo the years of lies, of the emptiness she'd felt, nor could it take away the quiet anger that was slowly rising within her. She could feel her pulse quicken as the anger began to take hold. Why had he waited so long to tell her? Why had he kept this from her mother, from herself? Zoe had always prided herself on understanding people, on being able to see past the surface, but now, she felt completely lost in a sea of uncertainty. The man in front of her had been a part of her life for so long, and yet he was a stranger. He was the key to unlocking the truth, but that truth was nothing like what she had imagined. She took a shaky breath, fighting back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Every inch of her wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she held herself back. Not yet. Zoe needed space, time to digest this, to make sense of what had just happened. The words "I'm sorry" hung heavy in the air, but they were just words, and she couldn't allow herself to be comforted by them. Her mother had loved her, that much was clear, but Zoe now understood that love came with a price. Her mother had tried to protect her, to shield her from a world of pain, but now Zoe was being forced to face that very pain. She turned away slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. The coldness of the doorknob sent a shiver through her, but she grasped it tightly, the pressure helping to ground her. She didn't look back as she stepped into the hallway, leaving Richard and the weight of the truth behind her. For a moment, she just stood there, her back against the wall, eyes closed as she tried to steady herself. The emptiness of the hallway seemed to echo her own feelings, isolated, uncertain, and broken. Zoe wiped away a tear, her mind still spinning. She wasn't sure what to feel. Grief? Anger? Betrayal? All of it? The storm inside her didn't seem to be calming anytime soon. She knew that she couldn't move forward until she understood everything, until she had all the pieces of the puzzle. But right now, she needed to be alone. She couldn't face anyone, especially not Richard. Not yet. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother. She could almost hear her mother's soothing voice in her mind, could feel the warmth of her embrace. She had always trusted her mother, had always believed in the strength of their bond. But now, as the truth unfolded, Zoe was beginning to see that the woman she had adored had been hiding something monumental. Her mother had protected her in the only way she knew how, by keeping this secret. But now, Zoe had to live with the consequences. She could feel the weight of that decision, a burden that had been passed down to her. With another deep breath, Zoe wiped her eyes, the tears still lingering on her cheeks. She wasn't sure what the next step was, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't continue to live in ignorance. She needed to know everything, no matter how painful it was. She couldn't let the secrets of the past define her future. Zoe turned away from the door, walking down the hallway with a renewed sense of purpose. She would uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting the deepest parts of her heart. The road ahead was unclear, filled with questions and pain, but Zoe was determined to face it. She wasn't just a victim of the past, she was the one in control now. She had the power to rewrite her story. And she would.